Hello and welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 16 of The Silver Chair, The Healing of Harms.
We made it. This is it. The final chapter.
Yes, we're here for the final chapter of The Silver Chair, and we have brought along Rachel Rigdon. There's a lot of alliteration there with Rachel's name too, and reinforcements. Before we hear from Rachel, I want to introduce her. She is a classical educator. She's been doing that for the past 2 decades. She's taught early education all the way through high school, and in addition to teaching, she has also co-written a composition textbook for Veritas Press, and is a classically trained violinist who performed professionally for about 15 years. So quite the list of credentials there. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, fun fact, Rachel used to hang out with Taylor Swift. Is that right?
It's true. I don't know if she remembers it.
I don't think she ever forgets a violinist.
Yeah. You did. This is true that in your career, you did get to play with Taylor Swift. So
yeah. I lived just north of Nashville, and it was kind of a common thing for classical players out there to kind of freelance in the recording scene, the pop scene. So that's how we made that connection.
Cool.
Well, Rachel, we're really excited to have you on. You really have the privilege of working with me every single day. Just teasing. So for listeners, Rachel and I both teach middle school humanities together. And so Rachel has a ton of experience. And one, you're just a really big fan of Lewis, and you're going to bring a lot of that to the show. But you have a lot of great experience in the classical world. And here at the end of chapter 16, we enter back into the experiment house. And so we thought that'd be a great time to bring in a classical educator and talk a little bit about Lewis's views on education.
Yeah.
Well, before we do that, though, Rachel, one of the things we ask all of our guests who come on is, how did you first encounter the Chronicles of Narnia?
Well, I was raised in a family of parents who read a lot to us aloud. And so my mom usually was the one that read aloud to us. But for some reason, my dad read all of the Chronicles of Narnia to me and to my sister. And then I went to this little private school for elementary school, and so we read them again in that school. So I think I heard on the podcast that one of your guests on the show also liked those BBC Narnia adaptations, which we were completely raised on those too. So yeah, so that was my first encounter with Narnia, and then I homeschooled my own kids. So we also went through the Narnia series twice as read-alouds. Mm-hmm. So,
have your kids, because you have your children are teenagers now, have they ever returned to the books as older readers? Now I know they're not adults yet, but they're getting. I mean, your oldest is getting a little close.
Yeah.
Have they returned to the books, or is it like, no, we did that as 8-year-olds and we're done?
It's funny. My 19-year-old is kind of on a Lewis kick right now.
Okay.
And the 17-year-old too. They have, during the quarantine, I think they both read Screw Tape Letters. They both read Till We Have Faces. So they're kind of like on a
sure.
Yeah, a new kick. But they did read them independently. I mean, this was really a normal thing in our family. We would go through a read aloud, and then like a couple years would pass, and then our kids would pick it up and read it independently. So they all did that with Narnia too, but we haven't really revisited it. Although we reference, we kind of have our own shorthand by referencing Narnia characters as a way to describe, other things that we see, or other scenarios, other people, whatever.
Ways you can gossip about people without feeling bad. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Like,
oh, that person's such a Puddleglum.
Or like I saw he's got a total reap a cheap thing going on.
Yeah. Exactly. I love it. Well, in reading those books many times with your your kids and just yourself. Do you have a favorite book in the Chronicles of Narnia?
It's funny. Actually, Silver Chair, I think, is probably my favorite. It is one of those books where we end up pulling from the imagery and the kind of the symbols from that book as a way of thinking about the seduction of this world, kind of like we reference Prince Rilian in the chair as kind of a way of thinking about being seduced by the spirit of the age, or being, kind of under the enchantment of worldly thinking, whatever. Like, it ends up coming up kind of a lot. And I think even especially as my kids have gotten older and are drawing their own conclusions about the world and thinking through worldview and stuff like that, we just kind of pulled from that image a lot of times.
That's great. Well, I'm glad we have you on here for the Silver Chair then.
Yeah, I know.
All right, so before we ask you a few more questions, Rachel, I think it might be helpful for listeners to know that the school that you and I teach at is a nonprofit, kind of a sliding scale private school that blends classical and Charlotte Mason pedagogy for students no matter their income level. And I just think that might be helpful as listeners to hear from you to know that that's your approach when you're talking about classical ed right now. But we're going to do something a little bit different than what we usually do, which is when we bring on a guest. We're going to take this sidebar here and talk a bit about education, and it's not going to be till the end of our conversation that we kind of tie it all back to C.S. Lewis. So I just want to give listeners a heads up, because it's going to sound like we're getting off track here, but I promise this all does eventually come back to Lewis. This book, The Silver Chair, it's bookended, both the beginning and the end, with the Experiment House, this modern educational institution. And even though Lewis wouldn't have necessarily used some of the terminology we're going to use, he is highly critical of modern education, and we see that in some of his works where he advocates for a more classical approach to learning. In fact, if you just Google C.S. Lewis and the classical education or the Trivium or something similar, you'll find just countless articles. And so I think this is going to be a great opportunity for us to get a better understanding of the kind of education that Lewis was passionate about. So with all that in mind, Rachel, could you give us an explanation of what classical education is?
Yeah. Well, the modern resurgence of classical ed is often attributed to Dorothy Sayers, who was actually a detective novelist who graduated from Oxford because she wrote this essay called The Lost Tools of Learning, which I'm sure you've read, Daniel. And in it, she critiques modern education. This was published in 1947, so I looked it up. This is like 6 years before Silver Chair was published, but so they would have been contemporaries thinking about, modern education for the time. But the trends that she was noticing and that she critiques in that essay have only become even more conventional, in the intervening time between then and now. So she goes on in that essay to prescribe a return to classical education that's based on the idea of the trivium. And that really is an organizing idea for modern classical educators. So the trivium is a 3-stage process that aligns instruction to stages of development, which, for educators, that's not on the face of it particularly controversial, because all philosophies of education, acknowledge some kind of relationship between skills and content and a kid's, like cognitive development. But we'll see, I think, some ways that constructivist thinking and classical ed kind of diverge as we talk about it. But in classical ed, we talk about first the grammar stage, then the dialectic stage, and then the rhetoric stage. So in the grammar stage, this most modern classical educators talk about it as occurring between the 1st and 4th grade, although I don't think these grade delineations were really always the thing that they are now. So that's something we've sort of applied to this sort of medieval way of thinking about education. During this time, kids should spend most of their time learning the grammar of subjects and developing affection for virtue through a variety of embodied learning experiences like extensive reading, exploring nature, listening to music, memorization of good poetry. I think we see here the greatest overlap between classical ed and like Charlotte Mason, which is something that Daniel and I, talk a lot about at our school. So when we talk about, this is sometimes not something super understandable to people right off the bat, but when we talk about the grammar of a subject, we're talking about the building blocks of information related to understanding the whole of a topic or a subject. So what constructivists would find controversial or even like regressive about this way of educating is that children don't necessarily have to grasp the full meaning of the content they're internalizing at this point. And this
Correct.
and so this is something that, modern classical educators are intentionally throwback about. So for classical educators, memory often precedes understanding, whereas with constructivists, and I'm like reducing this discussion. I mean, I ascribe to constructivism in some ways, but they would maintain that understanding precedes memorization and fluency. So this is where we get that pejorative kind of rote memorization to denote a kind of like pointless, drab learning experience that doesn't really transform anyone. So that's the grammar stage. That's basically like elementary. Next, we have the dialectical stage, which is sometimes called the logic stage. And this is when children begin to question the why behind the what that they have internalized up to this point. This is like the typical middle school student that Daniel and I know so well. Although the logic stage really is generally thought to include the first couple years of high school too. It's like up through like age 15. And I don't know, it seems to me like people are younger and younger in high school. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. So during the logic stage, we leverage that argumentative impulse, that's in adolescence, and we recognize their readiness to understand arguments and systems. So like traditionally, and for most modern classical educators, students study formal and informal logic during this time of life. I did this with my kids, and it was like they have kind of an interest and a flair for this kind of organized way of building argument or deconstructing.
I think a lot of times, and sorry to interrupt you. I feel like a lot of times my students, they love these like gotcha moments of kind of being able to, I guess you could say, just identifying these kind of arguments of fallacy, right?
Oh, yeah. Fallacies. It's everyone's favorite.
And they just can point out and be like, oh, that's this thing. Or, we'll talk in my class about reductio ad absurdum, and we'll move all these arguments to their, absurdity, and they love doing that. And I think anyone, if you're not even familiar with classical education, if you're familiar with middle schoolers, this is very true of just who they are at that developmental stage.
Oh, there's no swagger.
In any kind of school system.
Yeah. There's no swagger like a middle schooler who knows about the fallacies. I mean, they just love to point them out.
Yeah. Well, it's like the first time, when I can remember when I did this with my own parents and maybe you might feel this. Actually, Phil was a much better behaved child than I was, so maybe you don't feel this way, Phil. Tell me if you do. But like the first time you like correct your parents when they say something wrong, even if it's something small like, well, actually you were supposed to use well instead of good there. You need, it's talking about adverbs and adjectives. And you just are like, I'm right. And I love that. Did you ever feel this way, Phil?
Oh, it didn't. I don't think it happened as much. My mother was an English teacher and still is, so I was usually on the receiving end of that. But now I can't not hear it. For example, you just said Phil and me, or Phil and I, whichever one was wrong, a few minutes ago, and it just pops up in your head. So I know exactly what you're talking about, but I think it happens more with our friendship than with my parents.
That's true. God. And actually, we didn't mention this, but your mother is also a classical educator.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm surrounded.
Awesome. So also in the dialectic stage, students kind of engage in more analysis as they read. It's not analysis as a set of like discrete skills that would ruin a good book, but as an organic extension of the way they're thinking about their experiences at this time. They start to do a little bit of synthetic thinking, making connections between what they read and a movie they've seen or another book they've read or, an experience they've had. There's a real variety. I think most modern classical educators would recognize that stages are different than ages, like in public school, we're very focused on ages, like you're 5 when you're in kindergarten or you're whatever. But you could be, these stages could be very unique from person to person.
And this makes sense when you think about like someone like C.S. Lewis, who, in his best moments as a student were with Kirkpatrick, right? Where he wasn't in like a class of 35 people. He was being, privately tutored. And so it's not like, Lewis he wasn't in the 10th grade. That's not how it would necessarily work. And if you think back to the medievals and the way that education existed in medieval, Western Europe, during the Middle Ages, you're not seeing like necessarily these large schoolrooms, and what you're seeing more often is going to be tutors, and that's why grades don't necessarily mark up, and that doesn't necessarily translate into our modern day, at whether it's private, public, homeschool, any kind of education system, because one of the good things about the modern age is that we're educating most people as opposed to just some of the population. And so when you start to educate everybody, it means that you don't really it's not like we don't have enough teachers often for, to have small class sizes. How would we ever have enough teachers for everyone to, have their own set of tutors,
Right. Okay, so lastly, we have the rhetoric stage, and this stage happens really at the end of high school. It's not really high school. It's like, 17, 18, 19, those years. And it marks a student's readiness to not just understand arguments and systems, but to begin building them. So some hallmark emphases in this stage are persuasive speaking, beautiful writing. For some people, these are years when it makes sense to begin specializing a course of study to align with the student's interests or gifts. One last thing, classical education emphasizes the interrelatedness of all subjects. So it's kind of the opposite of the Prussian factory model of education, where nothing a person learns has any bearing on anything else they learn, and no one really understands the point of anything. As a kind of organizing outline to the whole enterprise, classical educators use chronologically presented history to create a timeline, which we use to explore and organize literature, science, philosophy, music, art, anything like that. So that's how that's sort of the content outline that we use to just organize the information.
I think that's really helpful for any of our listeners that might not be familiar with this. So let's talk now about Lewis and his relationship with modern education, because Lewis, not just here in The Silver Chair, but then also in The Abolition of Man and in That Hideous Strength, which I just need to pause for a second and tell all the listeners who told me to go read that book. I finally did read it, recently finished it, and it is absolutely incredible. I think it's probably Lewis's most underrated book. Not my favorite, but his most underrated book. I really enjoyed it. But, in all three of those works that I just listed, he talks a lot about education. And, even the whole idea of the abolition of man, he's critiquing a modern, by his standards, 1940s textbook written for students. I think it's the blue book, or maybe it's the green book. I can't remember which one it is. But why did this kind of approach to education bother Lewis, and why do you think he was so much more passionate about what we might call, again, I don't know if he would have used this terminology, but what we might call a more classical approach to education?
Well, so it's interesting, Daniel, you and I both read Abolition of Man recently, like over Christmas break or something. Like we both just decided to reread it. And one thing that Lewis argues in that series of essays is that there exists this underlying organizing universal law of morality, and without that we can't distinguish between what is good and what is not good, or what's worth pursuing, what's not worth pursuing, and that's inherent in designing any kind of system of education. It's always a system of discriminating. What am I going to include? What am I going to leave out? And so he would argue that like modern education attempts to kind of kick out from under itself these categories, these moral imperatives, but retain a sense of organization, of discrimination, some means of deciding what a person should or shouldn't learn. And he argues, that you can't critique the system of moral values from without. You can only do it from within the system. You can only admit that there are these binding categories, these binding laws. And so he would say modern education disregards that, but in a way that's not genuine, because modern education does have its own set of moral laws. So I think his also, like Dorothy Sayers picks up this thread in Lost Tools of Learning, that with dispensing with these moral categories, a public loses its ability to think rationally, to behave morally, to behave justly. And so I think it felt for Lewis, it seems like, as like a fight for the survival of civilization. But you can see why that's so controversial, because somebody is determining these moral categories, which is why Christian classical education, sometimes people say Christian classical education, sometimes people just say classical education. But, as believers, we are people of the book. We are people who subscribe to a written law of moral authority. And so for us, there's a natural symbiosis here with classical education. And I think Lewis is hailing from that same way of thinking about the world.
But yeah, this has been a great conversation about classical education and kind of the ways that it impacts Lewis. And I think that hopefully we have a better idea of the way that some of this thinking, although Lewis wasn't, again, I'm not trying to paint him as like, oh, he was this classical educator kind of guy, but he very much was, part of this world, even though this really like this kind of like neo-classical education didn't exist yet. So he would be before that. He was friends with Dorothy Sayers. He wasn't, he's part of the people that, a lot of us in this community look back to.
For sure.
Well, it is now time for us to jump back into the final chapter. We've had this great long conversation. Now I'm almost sad that we have to finish The Silver Chair here, because it has been a really great book. It's been a great season, but this is where we are. Jill, Eustace, Puddleglum, and Rillian, they've returned to Narnia. They've made their way back to the surface, and now we have one more chapter to go.
Right. Well, what's even harder is I just finished The Lord of the Rings last night, and then I finished The Silver Chair this morning, and all these wonderful stories are coming to an end, and I just need to take a minute.
You have nothing left to
listeners, we're
going
to do it. Yeah,
that's right.
We'll do a couple
Except
minutes of
for 3
silence
more
here.
books in The Hobbit, and then everything else that was written by these authors. But
have you not read The Hobbit before?
I've had it read out loud to me, but it was a long time ago. Does
that count as, this is not me making fun of you, do we count that as reading a book or no?
I count it.
It's tough. I do think it counts if you paid attention, but there's no way to verify that you actually paid attention. You could listen to an audiobook and you're doing dishes and it gets too loud and you miss something key, and then the entire story is different.
So I'm glad you brought up the audiobook, because I think it does count. I think the same way that listening to something on Audible counts as reading it, or at least I think so. I don't like when people go like, oh, that you didn't really read it. Like, that's, come on. If that counts, then also having a book read to you, if you can remember it. Like if they, I don't really remember Go Dog Go when my mom read it to me, but I did read it many times supposedly. but I do remember my mom reading, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, so that counts, right? So.
Right. That's one of those things where I think that the origin of what counts and what doesn't count goes back to, it has to be elementary school. Like some kid saying that doesn't count.
Right.
Because what do you mean? What does it counting mean?
Right.
It doesn't mean anything.
It was all those like things at the public library where if you like read enough books over the summer, you got like an ice cream cone. And so to me, it was always about like, how do we count books?
Right.
That's like why I still use Goodreads to this day, because I feel like I have to conquer there has to be a numerical total at the end of each year of how many books I read.
Right.
Right.
And the funny thing is, I can go buy ice cream whenever I want to. Now I'm an adult.
Right.
All right, Phil. Well, it is chapter 16. It's an even chapter, which means you have the summary.
This is it. Eustace and Jill are informed they will have the rare honor of riding centaurs back to Cair Paravel. Leaving Puddleglum, they enjoy a magical journey through the Narnian trees, and after being ferried across the river, see a bright ship with King Caspian aboard. From a distance, they see him and Prince Rilian reunited one last time before the king falls back onto his pillows and passes away. Aslan appears and takes the children to his country, where they are able to reunite with Caspian, who no longer looks old and gray. Before parting ways, Aslan takes them all to the experiment house, where they swiftly right many injustices with their weapons. Rilian, now a king, buries his father and rules the land well, and the opening into the depths of the underworld is left open for Narnians to enjoy.
The end.
The end.
That was a really great chapter summary. That's one of the best ones you've ever done, Phil.
I appreciate
a really special chapter here. Well, what were our initial thoughts here? Our kind of emotional reactions to this final chapter in the Silver Chair?
Well, I binge read The Silver Chair in 2 sittings because I am actually in the audience in the class that Daniel is teaching. And this was our assignment. I know. But it really served me well because I was really emotionally caught up in the story. And so much so that I cried in this chapter, which, Daniel will tell you, it's no big thing because it happens all the time. But it's not.
They come over the announcements. They're like, lunch is going to be changed for today. And then Rachel loses it.
You're right.
She's not even ordering lunch. I don't know why she's upset, but here we are. She's fish sticks. Why are you doing this to me?
Oh, man. So, but I did find it really satisfying and really moving. And I also really was kind of caught up in the sensory details. This is something I remember feeling as a kid when C.S. Lewis would describe food, like a feast or something. It was always just gave me this sense of longing. I just want to be in that cave by that fire eating that whatever they're eating. So that I had that feeling.
And there are a lot of feasts in these last 2 chapters.
Yeah, man. It was great.
Yeah, I felt like this was one of probably my favorite goodbyes for a book, where we get to see a lot of the things that were brought up at the very beginning dealt with, but they were all dealt with pretty quickly. King Caspian and Prince Rilian being reunited, and then Caspian dying, but then also they get to see him again, and they're just, a few callbacks. He recognizes Eustace, he calls him a name, and there are just a lot of really nice but quick goodbyes. The best I've heard someone describe when they're spending too much time saying goodbye to everyone is a little hand wavy at the end, but it was okay. And I can't not see that, but I think that Lewis did a really good job here of not being too hand wavy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is back-to-back entries in the Narniad with incredible endings. I think both Dawn Treader and now Silver Chair end on such a strong note. I'm kind of torn. I'm always comparing things. I'm always wanting to list things, and I'm kind of torn between which one of these I like better, because this is just such a beautiful conclusion to the story. Everything that happens in Aslan's country is so emotional and so beautiful, and it should be beautiful because look where we are. We're in Aslan's country. And so there's this kind of just feeling of melancholy because you're sad that this is over, but you're also just kind of basking in the beauty of Aslan's country and in his presence and in this, river of life, if we want to call it that, that we see. And Caspian, not coming back to life, but being brought into new life here, being resurrected in Aslan's country is just such a great, it's this beautiful eucatastrophe at the end of the story. And so I love this chapter. Might be my favorite in the whole book, but just a really, really beautiful way to end the Silver Chair.
Yeah.
Well, let's start talking about this chapter. So the beginning of the chapter starts off with some breakfast in a cave. And like you said, Rachel, Lewis is like a still painter. You know, like when you first start, I always think of there's one by like Bruegel the Elder where he has like a bunch of just like grapes. And I don't really like grapes that much. But when I look at like some of Bruegel's paintings, I was like, I think I do like grapes. That's kind of how I feel with Lewis. Some of the food he's describing, I'm not even interested in. But I'm like, yeah, you know what? I do want some of that stuff.
That's exactly how I feel. Give me some of that trout or whatever they're having.
Yeah.
Right. I don't even know what frothy chocolate is, but sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the roast potatoes, he's got, we're talking about different beans, meaty, spicy ones. They're piping hot. They've got all kinds. He says the delicious smell of sausages and more and more and more sausages. I mean, there is all kinds of food here. They got the baked apples.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just... at raisins. Well, I don't know about the raisins.
No, you can
but
baked apples with raisins stuffed where the cores had been.
Oh, actually, I'm down with that. That's fine. I like raisins as long as they're not alone.
Right.
If they're in anything, I will always eat them. I have no issue with them.
No, they have to be disguised. They have to be like rock hard, tiny, covered in sugar. Or I'm not going to play.
Right. No, I disagree. You can even put them in my cereal. I'm like, yeah, give me more Frosted Flakes with raisins in them.
Okay.
Do you guys not do that?
No, you don't know what you're saying.
No. When I eat Lucky Charms, I take all the marshmallows out and I replace them all with raisins.
Oh man,
I'm just kidding. Don't. That's the worst thing ever. But yeah, this is this great, wonderful opening here where Jill wakes up and they have this wonderful breakfast. And I love that she has also slept in here, but her first thing, this is such a Jill thing. She turns and like acts as if Puddleglum and Eustace here. She's like, hey, you guys got to wake up. What have you been doing this whole time?
Right.
She just woke up herself.
Right. This is another great example of how a character can be truly changed by the end of a book, but still have those little glimmers of their old personality, where she woke up 2 seconds ago and she's feeling mightier, higher than thou, holier than thou.
Yeah. I also was thinking about how the scene where she wakes up and her physical body is so cared for. You know, she's warm. She's got so much food. And I don't remember which of, Daniel, you and I were just talking about this a couple weeks ago, but I don't remember which of Lewis's books it was, but he describes his experience of waking up in his boarding school. And he refers to it as the horror of waking. It was always freezing cold, no food, mercilessly abused by the other kids. And so, I don't know, it kind of has this like Little Princess quality, remember that book, Little Princess and Secret Garden, where she wakes up and there's this bounty and there's a fire in the fireplace and you just feel so relieved for that character. That just comes out, those scenes come out over and over. And it's this contrast to, his experience, I think.
Right. One of the funny side effects of reading authors from around this time, including Roald Dahl, is that I thought that the schools in England were just really rough, because there is really just the schools were old. But Roald Dahl, his job was to run out to the outhouse and wipe off the toilet seat with a handkerchief and sit on it for 10 minutes, and then run back in and get one of the older kids so they could go out and use a warm toilet seat.
Oh my gosh!
And I thought, man, this place sounds so rough.
I mean, there was a big part in the early 20th century, this kind of system that existed where the kind of older, there was this structure of hierarchy in a lot of those boarding schools where it was like bullying that was allowed and encouraged in the school.
Yeah, like hazing.
System.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah, it was like frat boy hazing, but they're 9 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is what, and Surprised by Joy, this is what Lewis talks so much. I think that's the book you're referring to, Rachel.
Okay.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I feel like it's Surprised by Joy. This is what Lewis refers to in that, and why he hated his time at those boarding schools so much, because this is what his experience was. And that's what we see here at Experiment House. This is allowed, right? In fact, the ones who are bullying and picking on other students are the ones who, they go visit the headmaster or the headmistress, and they become her favorites, right?
Yeah.
Right. The worst part of boarding school is probably the Dementors, though.
Stop. You were doing both an Office reference and a Harry Potter reference at the same time.
I'm not saying it wasn't skilled.
Well, as all this is happening, one of our favorite characters appears, Glimfeather the Owl. He reappears with some funny lines here to let us know that Rillian has left and he has gone off to meet his father. And we actually don't see Rillian again. We see him from a distance later on, but it's kind of a bummer that we didn't get a proper goodbye to Rillian, because we're going to get one for Puddleglum and for Eustace and Jill and even Caspian, but Rillian kind of goes off. And it is, like I said, it's a bummer, but I also do love it. Kind of is like this story, this narrative feature that reminds us that Rillian's story is really just beginning. He's just now becoming king. And so we don't say goodbye to him because his story in Narnia has just begun, right?
Also, there's the scene where Eustace, and this is later, but Eustace and Jill are kind of shamefaced before Aslan when they first see him, and they recall all the ways that they didn't follow directions, and he says, you did what I asked you to do here on Earth. It made me think about how, their intimacy with Rillian was really not the point, and even their knowing how the story ends with him was not the point. So I thought it was kind of appropriate that he just fades to black, kind of, because I just think it's sort of what Aslan is always preparing them for. Like, you do what I tell you to do, not because it's sensible or because there's some guaranteed outcome, which I'm going to reveal to you, but because I told you to do it. And so their obedience to him, they're following his instructions. That's really the point. And even if they never see Rillian again, it wasn't really about that relationship,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're making an illustration, if you don't want the focus to be on something, there are a few ways to do it. You can make it smaller. You can make it seem further away. You can make it less detailed. And I think that less detailed is exactly what that technique is what he's using here.
Yeah,
he mentions it. It's there, but we're always seeing it from far away. And you also see like the scale of what's happening, how many people it's impacting, because they can't even get close.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Rillian's whole role in this story makes Narnia feel larger than it has felt in quite some time. In all of the previous books, what's happening with our characters, the Pevensies for the first 3 books, that's always like the main thing happening in Narnia. So in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the main thing happening is Aslan has returned, and these 4 sons of Adam and daughters of Eve have returned to fulfill this prophecy, or not returned, but have entered into the world to fulfill this prophecy. And like, that's the biggest thing happening in Narnia at that time. In Prince Caspian, it's this whole fight between Caspian and Miraz, which obviously the Pevensies play a big role in. And Don Treader, we don't spend any time in Narnia. So like the only main story that we know that's happening in the world in the sea as they sail further east is just the adventures that our characters are on. But here in the Silver Chair, really at the end of the day, when this story is retold generations later, Eustace and Jill are not the main character. This is Rillian's story. If you think about one day when this becomes, its own history, Rillian is the one who is, whose mother is murdered by the Green Witch, the Lady of the Green Kirtle. He then spends 10 years in captivity. And then after that, he is rescued in some way, but really it's him who defeats. He's the one who fights her as that little snake. And then he leads them back through the underworld, back up to the surface. And yes, obviously Jill and Eustace play an enormous role, and Puddleglum as well too. But that's not going to be retold around the fire, hundreds of years from now. It's really a story of rising back up to fulfill this role as the king, right as his father dies. He returns just in the amount of time so that there is an heir to take this throne. And I really love that, because it's such a great reminder for us as believers. Rillian is obviously not God. Aslan is kind of that in this proposal, but it does remind us that, our role as we are sent out, just like Jill has been sent out by Aslan at the very beginning of this book, is to fulfill, like you mentioned, Rachel, is to fulfill what God has called us to do, what Aslan has given Jill as a task. It's not to become the hero of the story. And that might happen. There are great heroes of the faith, and we honor them, but that's not isn't about us. And I think often, especially in American Christianity, we so much want to individualize this and make this focused on us. And that's why things like the prosperity gospel are so tempting to so many people, because it lets you be successful. It lets everything be about you instead of you kind of being the one who's second or even third or fourth or down the line.
It reminds me, this is getting ahead in the story, but the scene when the witch is trying to convince them, she's using this magic on their minds and trying to convince them that the sun is a figment of their imagination, and Narnia and even Aslan himself, and the way Puddleglum, who really is the most obscure probably, if you think about, he's sort of this comic character, and the role of his persistent belief, his kind of faith in that moment, and the way that ultimately leads to, Aslan fulfilling the, restoring really into the throne. But you just see, to me, it was inspiring thinking about the role of the obedience of the collective body of believers behind any manifestation of God's will, thy kingdom come on heaven and on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, anytime we see that, there is this collective obedience, this system of obedience we don't even know, And so I thought in a sweet way, it really shined a light on the significance of his obedience in the cave.
Yeah. And it also speaks to just the power of a community. Mm-hmm. If any of those three had been by themselves, it would have been a very different story. Right. But as soon as the two children start to kind of lose sight of what's real, Puddleglum says, there's Aslan. Mm-hmm. And later when Puddleglum's not doing so well, someone else steps in. And it's really, really good to see.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of Puddleglum, we say goodbye to him here. Jill and Eustace bid him farewell. We get another great line from Puddleglum as he is sure that he's going to have his leg amputated here. But this is the goodbye for them. He gets a handshake from Eustace, and Jill gives him a kiss as they say goodbye. He doesn't know what kind of life he has to go back to, but Jill, she says I think he sounds as doleful as a funeral. I think that's the phrase that she uses. Mm-hmm. And that's when Puddleglum's like, hey, speaking of funerals,
and that's it. They're done at that point. We don't get to hear any more Puddleglum dialogue.
Yeah, I think that his last word in the book being the word funeral is a perfect way to say goodbye. But I am sad here because this is, he doesn't, I know we can't talk about the next couple of books for your sake, Phil, but I will say he does not play.
Actually, the next one, we're going to flip it, right?
That's true. And we'll talk about that at the very end of this chapter, but it will be flipped in the next season.
So for your sake. For
my sake, too. I know that he can't be in The Horse and His Boy because that takes place before this book.
Yeah, but time is different in Narnia.
So that's very true. Who knows when it takes place? But it is, there is no other book where Puddleglum is the main character. That's what I'll say. And so it's sad, in a way that this is his kind of our final moment with him as a major character.
Right.
Well, so all of this happens. These goodbyes take place, and then Jill and Eustace, they hop on the backs of some centaurs, and they ride to Cair Paravel. And when they arrive, you mentioned this earlier, Phil, they see the ship that King Caspian is on returning, and they decide to stay. They get a little shy here, and they decide to stay on kind of out behind the crowd. And what happens next, Phil? It's very interesting.
We see King Caspian coming off the ship, but he's not walking by himself. He's being carried down.
And is this right? Is he in a bed? I kind of imagine that, that story in the Gospels, the guy's like lowered down through the ceiling. I'm kind of picturing this same thing from the ship, that he's being kind of lowered down or carried down, I guess.
I think this speaks to our different educations. You're picturing this great biblical connection, and I'm picturing the thing in Emperor's New Groove where she's being carried around.
The Emperor's New Groove is one of the most underrated Disney
It's
movies.
so
I am
good.
so happy that you pulled from that. It's absolutely hilarious. So that's fine. But yeah, so he's being carried down, and then right here he looks up at Riley, and they get this kind of final moment. We don't know exactly what happens because our perspective as readers is with Jill and Eustace, who can only see this from a far off distance, and then Caspian dies. Caspian, the hero from the second and third books in this series, is gone. He lays down and Rillian, the prince, who is, I guess, now king, just lays his head down and he weeps.
Right. And Rachel, I'm so glad you're here for this part because of the way the music plays such a key role in this scene. And I listened to quite a few movie scores. It's something that is fun to work to. And Daniel, I'd love it if you could send me your quiet movie score playlist, because it really stresses me out when the climactic part of a movie, that part of the score is being played and I'm trying to debug something.
Yeah, dude, I'll send it. Movie Mondays in my classroom, that's what we do. We do quiet musical scores. So, Narnia gets in there a lot.
Of that.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
But just the way the music is described here, I feel like I could hear it. And the trumpets are announcing that the king is coming down. And then when he dies, the music changes. And it's this described as disconsolate blowing of horns. And it's a tune to break your heart.
Yeah, that stuck out to me too. And I was thinking about the role that music plays in helping us respond appropriately. I mean, one of the aims of classical education is to order your affections, to love the right things, to grieve the right things, to fight for the right things. And music is actually a means of helping us respond appropriately to what the experience is. And so you see the Narnians just doing this as part of the fabric of their culture. They're assisting each other in feeling, in ordering their affections in that scene. It was so sweet, so sad. And I just, and later when they talk about, I think it's, I'm saying this wrong because of how much I read the book, in one sitting. And so I keep saying like, well, I'm getting ahead of the story, when really like you guys are at the end of the story. So I'm not ahead of the story, but there's another scene where it's when this is getting ahead of the story. Cause this is when they come to Aslan's country and they still hear the music.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But they're also looking at Aslan's face and they don't know which is making them cry. I think that's really when I started crying, was thinking about how, we are living, this entire life on earth is like living in a metaphor designed to help us see what Jesus is like, what he will be like. It's like a mother's love. It's like a father's love. It's like this beautiful music you're hearing. It's somehow his presence does something to your heart like this music does, only, but the metaphor only goes so far. To me, that's what this sensory experience on earth is like. It's to forecast and help us to imagine what the presence of God will be like. And so to me, that was just such a powerful scene, thinking about, they didn't know, why is my heart breaking? Is it from Aslan's beauty or this music? And it's kind of this moment where the two worlds are coming together, the metaphor and the reality. They're just ushered into Aslan's country.
Right. And connected by that overarching music that's in the background.
Yeah, this transition, and this is where it happens, this transition out of Narnia and back into Aslan's country is a very, very emotional one, as there's this juxtaposition, like you said, of the despairing, I think that's the word that Lewis uses here, the music, and then the joy and the beauty of Aslan himself. And I love that you said that, Rachel, because I was struggling with this as a reader, just trying to figure out what was Lewis doing here. He made such a big point of it that I knew that it was something he wanted to stick with us, but I couldn't quite figure out what it is. And I think you're exactly right in what you just said. And it's this, I wanted just to point out what was really interesting to me. And I believe, I have to say this, the more I think about this, I feel like I've read this somewhere and I just don't know where it is. So this is not my own observation. I just want to put out there that it might be someone else's.
Just more plagiarism.
I know. It sounds like it's not an idea, but I was realizing as I was kind of telling Anna what happens in this story, because she's always behind us. Like she always, she listens to episodes when they actually are released and she'll read along with it then.
You should give her an advance copy, man. Come on.
I will if she asks.
She's your wife.
She enjoys it. She enjoys it. So I said, this kind of they enter back into Aslan's country, and I realized there's this clear kind of story structure here where the book starts out in our world and then it goes to Aslan country, and then they literally pretty much descend. Remember, because it's up there on the top of that cliff, and they descend down into Narnia, and then they descend further down into the underworld, and then they kind of ascend back up all the way back to Aslan's country, back into our world. And it literally is almost like the opposite of like that graph you draw, to show kids like story structure that you saw back in like elementary school and stuff. And just thinking about how much this book just is very symmetrical in that way. I can kind of like picture that right in my mind. And again, I feel like someone else pointed that out and I read it somewhere, but I don't know where I saw that. But it did make me think about that as they finally travel into Aslan's country.
Speaking about that moment when the kids are back, when Eustace and Jill realize they're back in Aslan's country, and when Caspian kind of receives his new body, there's this scene, which was another scene when I cried. I was kind of surprised. I had forgotten what their reaction was. Like in the reading this time, I had forgotten what the kids' reaction was, and I was anticipating that when it dawned on them that the reason he was growing younger was because he was dead, I was thinking that they would be afraid that they were dead too. Mm-hmm. Like kind of like a what's that movie?
Sixth Sense?
Yes. The Sixth Sense, yes. And how like this terrible realization, like, oh my gosh, I'm dead too. And instead they were like disappointed that they weren't, right. That they couldn't stay there, which just speaks to the beauty of Aslan's country. And I think it's interesting because as much as, we fear death, that reaction that they give will be our reaction, that will be the reaction of being in the presence of the Lord. Yeah. So I know I'm reading it too allegorically, but you would think that would be the children's response would have been like, oh no, but they're just
excited,
bummed that they have to go back. Yeah.
Let's also talk about this, because it's not just the children who get upset at all during the scene. There is Aslan himself who cries. He cries here. And as that scene goes on, he gets Eustace to go get this like thorn, and he punctures the paw of Aslan, who then bleeds, right? This blood redder than all the redness you've ever seen, into the stream. So we have, they get there, right? Caspian's body is in that same stream. The same stream that Jill drank from earlier in this story. And that as the blood splashes into the stream, that's the moment the music stops, and then that's the moment when Caspian begins to change. I mean, we have to talk about some of the... we're not going to use the A word like you did earlier, Rachel. We're going to say supposedly. Here.
I apologize.
I'm just teasing.
You're like, are you in my class or not? Are you paying attention?
We did in the class I'm teaching on Lewis. I'm like, guys, we don't use the word allegory here. It's not acceptable in this class. But in this supposal, what's happening here? You guys, let's walk through this. What do we think Lewis is doing?
Well, the Caspian is washed in the blood again, and in this new way. And as Aslan looks at the ravages, the decay of time, and the fall on just this aging face, or this aged face, he grieves it. And I just cried reading that. Like, it's so comforting to me to think about that our decay, even what we try to convince ourselves to accept as a natural part of life. And, you live a long life, it was your time, these things we say when an old person dies. But we never buy it deep down, we see the wages of sin in that. And so that Aslan, it reminded me of Jesus crying when Lazarus died. Yeah. He knew what he was going to do, but he still grieved it. And he grieved it knowing that Lazarus would then die a second time. I mean, it was just so interesting to think about what God grieves, from his perspective. But I just find it so comforting that our response to a decayed human being, the ravages of time, that we are in agreement with God in that response. And we don't have to talk ourselves out of it. So I was just overwhelmed by that scene.
Right. It's also fun to see the transformation that happens because Aslan's in charge of all of this. And a single drop of blood, it doesn't really matter how he goes about it. He's in charge. And this is just a visual way to show them that he's in charge because you see the effects immediately.
Yeah.
It's also just, it's almost on the nose here. And I do feel like with some of these that Lewis, as the series has gone on, is a little bit more freer with his supposals. This is, to me, seems like a pretty clear supposal of like this atoning blood, right? Caspian lies there dead in Aslan's country in this stream, and it's not until he has this blood, right? Like even though we know he's been a good king, we've been told that by the narrator that he's been a good ruler over Narnia. He still has the consequence of death, right? I don't think the word sin ever appears in the Chronicles of Narnia. At least it hasn't in the first 4 books. And yet that kind of like that imagery, right? And this kind of maybe this supposition here, we have this blood needing to atone for the wages of sin, the consequences of his sin. And through that is what brings this, Caspian's, his resurrection here. That's what's happening, right? He comes alive. He did die, but it's this thing. And he even tells the kids, like, I'm not a ghost. Like, this is not some kind of like spectral form that I'm in. This is what happens in Aslan's country.
Also, I like how when he does sort of receive his new body, he's at an age that's difficult to determine. And of course, Lewis makes that funny comment about like the worst adults are the most adult, just like the worst children are the most childish. And I also thought it was kind of cute and playful of him to include that description, because I was just thinking when my kids were really hearing about, as they were in like early elementary school and really got curious about heaven, they were obsessed with what age everyone was going to be and how is that going to work out, and how are we going to relate to each other if we don't have, if we aren't related in the timeline like we are here and whatever. And so I feel like C.S. Lewis, even though he makes that comment in Abolition of Man about how he was never very fond
of children,
small children.
Yeah.
Remember, right? And yet he thinks like them.
Oh, absolutely.
Because he includes this discussion about the age, what age they are, and I just thought that's something that would appeal to a first-time reader of C.S. Lewis. Of Silver Chair, if that person were a child.
I remember the catch-22 of being like a 9-year-old raised in the church, which was that like I wanted to live and die of old age, but I didn't want to be old in heaven. And I was like, so this kind of seems like I might live, and I did understand that heaven was eternal. And so I was like, I feel like if I live to be old, if I die of old age, then I win in the short term, but I lose in the long term, because then I'm like 95 in heaven. I've got this old body. That's how 9-year-old me was
totally
very, very disturbed by this. Like the fact that
well, I remember being super disturbed thinking that my parents and I would look the same age. Like, no, man, I need you to look like 25 years older than I do all the time.
Yeah. That's so funny. I can't, there will definitely be a time and the place to talk more about eschatology and heaven and the Chronicles of Narnia. Not in this book, but we'll save that for a future podcast. That's all I'll say for Phil's sake. Anything else we want to talk about in this section before we move on to the return to our world?
I just thought it was curious that Caspian wants to see Eustace and Jill's world. I mean, you know, they've seen Narnia, and you know but this is something he's always wanted to do, and Aslan says no.
Yeah, and it's very much in character for Caspian, you know, who is, you know, we didn't see this as much in Prince Caspian, but it was kind of a tense situation for him. But all throughout Dawn Treader, he's this great explorer, right? Like, he literally throws a temper tantrum at the end of the world because he can't go on and explore, and he has to go back and be a king. And so now, you know, that responsibility now has been lifted from him. He's not king anymore. That's his son's role. And so, you know, we get that same, though, character trait of his, of wanting to explore and see more, lives on here. And we see that even after death, in eternity, we don't become some just, you know, blurs of light who just are absorbed into God, right? No, like, we retain parts of who we are, obviously. And so, you know, he still wants to explore. He's heard that they even live on a spherical world. Remember that back in Dawn Treader? And he's freaked out that they don't live on a flat world. He's got to see that. And so I love that he wants to do that. There's also this great line where, you know, he asks, you know, I'd like to go there if that's not a bad thing to want. And Aslan reminds him, you know, here in Aslan's country, he cannot want wrong things anymore.
That's right.
That's just not possible. He's here in this
place.
Specifically
now that he has died.
Yes.
Yeah, because he was in Aslan's country before, but he wasn't allowed to stay.
Well, did he I couldn't remember this. Did he didn't go with them, right? I thought he had to stay on the ship, and Reepicheep was the only one that went. Is that wrong?
Well, so I'm a little confused. When they're on the beach and they're standing by the wall of water, is that Aslan's country, or is that like the holding area? Are they in the holding area right now? Because he says they're in Aslan's country. But
I thought that was just the end of the world, and going over the crest of the wave was Aslan's country. Because Reepicheep goes over the crest of the wave, as opposed to the children who you know, they don't go into Aslan's country. The Pevensies and Eustace go back into their world from that little last part of strip of land there.
Okay. I think I was confused because they didn't get on a floating thing and rise up in the air like Reepicheep did.
In the BBC version, when he used the UFO, version. Just like zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got $5 for the special effects, so get the fire hydrant out. We'll just try to fix it in post.
Shoot him up into the air.
That makes sense, Daniel, how you were saying about this just being kind of in character for Caspian, because Rillian makes a similar kind of curious, like he's like, you know, about to go back to Narnia, and yet he feels so torn because he wants to go into that underworld.
The Bism, yeah.
You know, and explore that. Yeah. So maybe this is just like a family trait. Like, even when they're, you know, even when they have the desire of their heart right in front of them, they still have this wanderlust. They still want to, you know.
And I love that about them. I love that carries through for all of them. Well, Caspian is granted this wish. He does get to return, and here we have just a great scene. I really feel like this is wish fulfillment on Lewis's part, as we mentioned earlier. So Aslan roars. He shakes the sun, and the walls fall down, leading back into our world. And he instructs Jill. She gets like this tree, or this like branch that turns into a riding crop, and the boys, Eustace and Caspian, take the flat of their swords, and they run back into our world. There's also, I forgot to mention this, there's this part where Aslan breathes onto Jill and Eustace too. He almost like sends them out with, you know, we had an email from Hannah earlier, Phil, mentioning something similar about the Great Commission. But here again, which we love that email. Here again, there's like this sending out now back into our world by kind of breathing on them, as Aslan's breath kind of often might symbolize the Holy Spirit here. And then they run back into our world to fight these bullies.
Right. And what a scene. And how about these names? These are great names. We have Adela Pennyfeather. I'm not even going to try to attempt this second one. The major one. Can you read that?
No, you have to do it, because I always get made fun of mispronouncing things, so you got to do it.
Yeah, but it's regular it's normal for you to get made fun of. Cholmondeley Major, Edith Winterblot, Spotty Sorner, Big Bannister, and the two Lonesome Garrett twins.
Oh, those Garrett twins, you know them. So in all of this, Aslan, in a very like Exodus 33 style, imagery here, he only shows his back, right? He just shows his back to the bullies, and yet they still see this lion as large as an elephant and these three kind of warriors charging at them, and they cry, murder fascist lions. It isn't fair. And the word fair is italicized here by Lewis, really telling you how he feels about this whole situation. So after this kind of playful beating up of the bullies, that is when we get this long paragraph about the head of that school. That the head, she sees all this happening, so she calls the police, obviously, because there's a lion at her school. And when the police show up, they believe that she's a lunatic. And here, let me just pause for a second and remind us that in Dr. Michael Ward's, Planet Narnia, this book is associated with the moon, which has symbolism. The planetary influence could often lead to lunacy, and Lewis literally uses the word lunatic here, that the head is behaving like a lunatic. That's kind of that planetary influence that we see. And then there's the really, really great sentence he has where after the head gets expelled, after the students get expelled, here's what Lewis says. After that, the head's friends saw that the head was no use as a head, so they got her maid and inspector to interfere with other heads. And when they found that she wasn't much good even at that, they got her into Parliament, where she lived happily ever after.
This is just Lewis taking down one group after another.
Oh, I love it.
We're going to attack everyone from the bullies to those people in Parliament that made my life bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And just this rewarding of incompetence, and this is actually what people feel sometimes. Like, if you can't cut it as a teacher, well, go work for the central office or whatever.
Yeah. This is Lewis's disdain for bureaucracy, which we have talked a lot about on the podcast, but we see it here in this, and that's one of my favorite lines. In fact, here on the Kindle version, 369 people have also highlighted it, so we know that other people enjoy this as well too. Well, then after that, there's only 2 paragraphs left. Phil, what happens to end this story?
Well, Eustace and Jill both hide their clothes, but in different ways. Eustace buries his, and Jill holds on to hers and hides them at home until it's time for the next ball, the next winter, and she wears her fancy clothes then.
Jill is way smarter here, right?
Right.
Jill's like, I'm going to go ahead and just hide them in my house. And Eustace is like, I'm going to bury them underground at school.
Yeah.
I love that.
And then we get a very short but meaningful glimpse back into Narnia. And we find out that King Aurelian, so he's now king, has buried his father, Caspian the Navigator. And he's mourned for him. And things are going really well. Aurelian leads well. And it even gives us a quick update on what they did with the underworld, or the connection to the underworld. They left it open. And Lewis gets a little bit Lonely Planet here and says, don't forget to have a look at those caves. If you're ever there, be sure to check that out.
Well, that brings us to the end of the Silver Chair. Do we have any final thoughts on this chapter before we wrap up here?
Just one final connection to what Lewis might be saying about education, just because we end back at the experiment house. But there is this theme of the value of internalizing beauty and truth, so that not because it's an ends to a means necessarily, but because it is what it's sort of gives you the lens of viewing reality. So Aslan tells, all the way through, starting with Jill with hide these 4 instructions in your mind. And then he, you probably said this in your podcast before, but it imitates that passage in Deuteronomy, when you go by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up.
Yeah.
And then later we see, them, fighting for the memory of the son of Aslan of Narnia. And I think kind of a subtle takeaway, a kind of final picture of what we should all be about as educators is encouraging kids to internalize, and ourselves to internalize the right kind of things, so that it transforms us, whether that's scripture or beautiful narrative passages or poetry that points beyond itself to the truth, and how this is a way of steering us on the journey. Not because we know what Aslan's going to do necessarily, but because we will be the kind of person who is capable of obeying in the moment, because this is in our DNA. And so, I don't know, as we end the experiment house, at the beginning critiqued kind of the, talking about the experimental or these sort of modernistic, revisions that were going on there. This is sort of the message of the book. To me.
And what I love about that is Lewis is taking something that we've probably heard before, but he's presenting it in a new way. And for me personally, it gives me something else to remember that by. And here's another example. Here's that story that you've heard before, but here it is presented in a different way, and in a more visual way or a more updated way, but without changing the actual core inspirational text that's behind it. And so I feel like he's saying this is important, but also he's providing a step toward that at the same time.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way for us to end our coverage of the Silver Chair.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. This has been so fun to have you on.
It's been so fun.
Rachel, I want to again just say thank you so much for taking time out of your week to come on the show and sharing so much of your knowledge with us. I think that we have a better idea. We understand Lewis more now after you've shared a little bit more about education and classical education in particular.
Well, thanks so much. It was a blast being on.
All right. Well, it was a wonderful experience getting to go through this final chapter of The Silver Chair with Rachel. But Phil, we are not done yet.
Not yet. We have some emails.
Yeah, 3 emails. We figured, here we are, last chapter of the book. We're not going to cover another chapter for a little bit of time. And why not go out reading a couple of emails and really getting to talk a lot about Narnia before we go on our little hiatus here.
Right. And this first one is from Josh.
Josh
says, it's been a while since I've emailed, but I just finished listening to your podcast on Chapter 12 of The Silver Chair. I absolutely love this chapter and Puddleglum, who is my favorite character in all the Chronicles. I like him because he's not the overt hero type character, and he even makes some mistakes when it matters. He did the right thing. His character in a much different way is similar to King Theoden in The Lord of the Rings. They both made mistakes and were certainly imperfect leaders. But when their friends or people needed them the most, they made the right choices and were extremely brave. I also really love Puddleglum's speech because it encompasses how we feel in our Christian lives sometimes. The world often tells us living for Jesus isn't worth it, or not even reality, and often we won't even know in this life if living for Christ is worth it. But when we fight and live for something greater, such as Overworld, we fulfill a much greater purpose. I've loved your episodes on the Silver Chair, and I'm looking forward to the conclusion of the book.
That was a great email from Josh. Nice little short email here, and I picked this in particular, Phil, because you've just finished, I think we talked about this on the Dancing Lawn, you just finished reading The Lord of the Rings.
That's right.
And I wanted to know how you felt about this comparison between Puddleglum and the King of Rohan.
Yeah, I definitely see the connection there and the similarities. And that's something that I really appreciate too. I like it when characters are not completely good or doing completely the right thing every time. It also works for the villains. The villains sometimes do something that is kind of a good thing or helps somebody. And it makes it more complex and it makes it more complicated. And it also seems more real.
Yeah, I like this. idea of Theoden and Puddleglum, this comparison. I mean, because both of them are clearly good characters. Theoden in The Lord of the Rings and Puddleglum here in The Silver Chair, no one's sitting here like, no, they're anti-heroes. No one's saying, oh, they're these morally gray characters. That just isn't true. I don't think that'd be a good reading of either characters. But they are clearly good characters with some significant flaws. And I really love that, especially in books where you have characters that don't really have significant flaws. I mean, and now Puddleglum going with Eustace and Jill, I mean, he's literally walking with two people who are constantly making mistakes. But I would say two things from Silver Chair. We have Rillian, who really, he's not a main character in this book. We don't really see him make any significant mistakes after he's rescued and comes out of his little enchantment that he's under. But then also we clearly have Aslan, who is not making mistakes, and so it's nice to compare Puddleglum and Jill and Eustace together to those other characters. Same way with like Theoden. I mean, the one you often compare him to would be Aragorn, who I know in the movies it's a lot different, where he's like he doesn't want to be king, he's whatever. But in the books, I mean, he's from the Council of Elrond and on. He's like, no, I'm going to be king of Gondor, and he doesn't, he very much accepts that role. And you have Theoden, who, and Aragorn for the most part is not making a lot of mistakes along the way. He's this great hero, where Theoden, he struggles, especially just with some of the isolationism of Rohan and kind of the relationship between Rohan and Gondor. And so I really like this comparison. I think Josh has done a great job picking out a character from one of our favorite books that isn't in Narnia, and I'm sure many of our listeners also love The Lord of the Rings. This is a really great one, Josh. I really loved pointing out Theoden here as kind of a companion to Puddleglum.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for writing in, Josh. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, our next email is from Laura, and in this email, she says, "Hi, Daniel and Phil. I discovered your podcast while rereading Narnia as a welcome escape during quarantine. I had read The Magician's Nephew through The Horse and His Boy, chronological order I know, as a child, but had never finished the series until now. I was looking for a deeper dive into the series when I came across your show and have been hooked ever since. I found it interesting that you discussed in your last episode how the White Witch and the Lady of the Green Kirtle were not the same person. So I was interested, in fact, that I paused in the middle of the episode to share this with you. I have the 1994 HarperCollins set of books with cover art by Leo and Diane Dillon. In my books, there's a map of Narnia, and whatever surrounding lands are pertinent to that particular book. She says she has a feeling I would love this, and I do, because that was like one of the first kind of like running, not even jokes, but just like things that kept coming up was the fact
you didn't know where anything was.
I didn't know where anything was. It's still kind of unclear to me. She says, following the map, there is a list of characters. It covers all the main characters in the series and lists what book they appear in. The White Witch's entry reads as follows. She has taken over the land as the White Witch and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Completely evil, she is also very dangerous, even in the Silver Chair.
Oh.
Yeah. So let me keep reading her email, and then we will definitely come back and address this.
The 90s were a weird time. It was so hard to fact check stuff in 1994.
So Laura continues, though. I have read this description prior to reading The Silver Chair for the first time, and so went into the book assuming that the White Witch and the Green Witch were one and the same. I think the idea of them being separate is so fascinating and makes me wonder how the second witch might have gotten there. I have no idea who wrote the character descriptions in my book or at what point they came to be included, so who knows what Lewis intended. Just wanted to share in case you all thought this was interesting as well, and we obviously do, which is why we're reading this. She said that as a side note, I've seen on your social media comparisons between various cover versions of the books. Yeah, we love pointing that out. I love kind of showing different covers. As a graphic designer, illustrator, hey, what's up, Phil? I love and collect beautiful books and have always struggled finding covers for the Narnia series that I like. My personal favorite is the leather-bound Barnes & Noble special edition with all the books in one volume. It is a beautiful with gold foil and blue leather, and my favorite Pauline Bain illustration of Lucy and Mr. Tumnus on the cover. Unfortunately, Barnes & Noble stopped making it years ago, and it can only be found online for crazy resale prices. I once got it for my sister, a fellow Narnia lover, for over $100 on eBay. I've been hoping it will pop up in my local used bookstore, but until then, I'm curious whether you or any of your listeners have ever been able to get your hands on one. Maybe if we all write to Barnes & Noble, they'll start producing them again. Anyway, thanks for all that you do. I've loved diving deeper into these stories that I've loved all my life and exploring the ones I haven't read before. My favorite book is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The movie is one of my favorites of all time, but I can't wait to hear your discussion of The Horse and His Boy and The Magician's Nephew. Further up and further in, Laura.
So, in terms of that edition, I don't know if this is the same one that we're talking about here, but Sarah Cozart had a really nice illustrated edition, and I looked into that one as a Christmas gift for Daniel, but then I also saw the ridiculous resale prices, and I thought, I don't know if spending $1,200 on this edition of a book that we already have multiple copies of is going to be the best use of resources right now, but there are some really nice editions, and that would be wonderful if Barnes & Noble started reprinting that.
Barnes & Noble does that with I know exactly the book she's talking about. Barnes & Noble has those kind of like their classic series, not like they have like one line of classic series. They're just like paperbacks, like trade paperbacks. And then they have another one that are these beautiful hardcovers. And for me, some of the covers are just kind of wild. They have one for Dune, which it feels weird to see like Dune have all this like beautiful foil on it and stuff because to me it's just such a
exactly what you're talking
kind
about.
Of thing.
It has gold leaf pages too, right?
Exactly, yeah. But this copy of the Chronicles of Narnia, my grandmother has one on one of her shelves at her house.
Really?
So I have seen it. The funny thing is, I'm actually not sure she's ever read the books. Maybe she did like a while ago. She's not. My grandma is a huge reader, but is not interested in fantasy. Like that's just not her thing at all. But she does have that book, and I've taken it off the shelf before and looked at it and thought it was beautiful. I didn't know that they didn't sell it anymore. That is a bummer to hear. But I'll post like a link in the episode's description of that cover because it is just a great, beautiful blue with that gold foil. And then that picture of Tumnus and Lucy on the cover together just perfectly encapsulates the spirit of Narnia. It's a great copy of the book.
Yeah. Speaking of graphic design, the cover that I have I have all 7 books in, unfortunately, chronological order. And it's the edition that Barnes & Noble is still selling as of maybe a year ago when I checked last. But it has Aslan, and then they photoshopped flames into his mane, which is an interesting choice. It's very early 2000s design, which is when I got it, around 2003.
I would agree with Laura here, though, that, and maybe this is a controversial opinion, maybe it's not, there's no editions, I should say, of the books that I absolutely love the covers on. My favorite happen to be the ones, I think they're from like the 70s.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's the one I grew up with.
They're in publication order. The one for the silver chair is like Rillian. They almost look very cartoonish, but it's like Rillian, smashing the silver chair. I don't actually think they're good covers. I just resonate with them. I think they're nostalgic, and so I really like them.
Those are the ones that were on the antique bookshelf that we had with the glass panes covering it, and you had to like open the little door to get to them, and they still smelled like the 70s, or what I imagine the 70s smelled like.
So I do like those, even though I'm not actually that keen on the art. They just feel special to me, and they're like super, also like very like pastel colored, like the numbers on them and stuff. It just feels not super Narnian. But there's also that 1994 version that Laura was talking about in her email. Those are the versions that I actually was like gifted as a kid that I read. Like we had the other version too, but these were the ones I even had multiple copies as a kid. But I remember like on Easter one year in like my Easter basket, we always would get some kind of like Christian book or something, related to the holiday. And I got the silver chair, actually, believe it or not. And I always think those are really beautiful renditions of the books. In fact, my classroom set of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that I use every year is that copy. And I have Sharpied over all of them the 2 where it says Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I put 1 there. So there's no more complaints about why.
You showed them.
Yeah, I proved it. But you and I have actually talked about doing this, Phil, for one of our dancing lawns later this year, maybe doing like a video podcast where we do the hot thing on YouTube, although it'll be old by the time we get to it probably, which is making a tier list of all the different Narnia book covers and kind of ranking where we place all the different covers.
Yeah. I thought you were going to have us do we react to the different movie scenes and break down comparing them to the books. Have you seen those?
I'm not yeah, I know a lot of people like it, so I don't want to.
You don't like that.
I do not want to see other people watch things.
Yeah.
Now, again, I don't mind commentary. I'll watch or listen to movie commentary or, things like that, but I don't want to watch someone react to another video. I don't want two screens in my YouTube video. I'm not interested in that.
That's my least favorite thing about when people are live streaming and they're reading the chat. It's just this really awkward 10-second
we can
pause.
see this. What are you doing?
Yeah.
I've already read it. You don't need to say that. Yeah. The reacting to trailers and stuff is not my cup of tea.
Oh no. I couldn't. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels really performative too. Like it's like you're over dramatic to make sure that people go, "Oh, look at that shot." I'm like, it's a shot of Yoda. Calm down.
I think that I would watch a video of you watching people react to stuff.
Just be like really cynical and upset and grumpy about everything.
Yeah, really meta.
All right, well, we still got to talk. There's so much to get to into Laura's email. We have not even talked about this this character chart for Narnia.
Yeah, so this is built into the book. What I'm kind of picturing, and I know this isn't true, is kind of a DK Publishing breakdown of all the characters with the, like they do for Star Wars, where they have the little info and they have a line pointing to the different parts. They break down like what's in a stormtrooper's blaster.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. I don't know if they ever made something like that, like an equivalent.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of like the Dramatis Personae, right? That kind of like list of the characters in the novel. And I actually, this is kind of a bummer. I have that one of those Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobes from this edition in our house, but it is in my son's room and he's sleeping right now. So we've been so I
do a quick cost benefit analysis of
I'm not
being
going to
able
wake
to
him
record because you wake him up.
but I do know exactly what she's talking about. Now, I honestly have not read any of those character bios in a long time. But I am surprised to see that they would say that this is the same person. I mean, we shouldn't be that surprised. This is the same HarperCollins and we don't want to rag on HarperCollins. They do a lot of great stuff, but they're also putting it in chronological order, which was not necessarily a direct wish of Lewis. And we have to acknowledge, and Laura correctly acknowledges this, that Lewis didn't write these character descriptions. Someone else did. But that seems so interesting. You and I had said, and I think it was William when he was on the show, kind of saying that we thought the only reason people thought this about these two characters was because of Barbara Kellerman and the BBC version of the books. But that's actually, I guess we were wrong. We were wrong here because there's in the books. Now wait. Actually, I'm now thinking this out loud. That BBC version aired before 94. So maybe it still does come from that same place, that like somebody whoever is in charge of writing this watched the BBC movies instead of reading the books. They were like, me in high school doing the homework.
Not doing their work.
It's like, okay, guys, we're going to read Jane Eyre. And I'm like, okay, did BBC do that? Did they have one of those for me that I can do that? Or read the Spark Notes?
What was the big one? It was, we were supposed to do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and everyone watched Blade Runner, and then they got an F.
I actually have never read that. Although you and I have seen Blade Runner together. Didn't we watch that together?
We did. We watched both that one and 2049.
I like 2049 so much better. And maybe it's just because I'm a millennial that I just didn't grow up with the original, which I still like. But
it's one of the few times the sequel 30 years later is actually really, really good.
Yeah. And I also am not a huge fan of Harrison Ford in non-charismatic roles. Put him in stuff where he's likable. He's kind of just depressed through the whole movie, and get a different actor for that. I want to see Harrison. I don't actually need to see range from Harrison Ford. I just want him to be that same charismatic guy in every movie. But
you want him to be like handling snakes and stuff? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. But back to this, that's so interesting what Laura points out here, that this is something that people are picking up from the books themselves. So we'll have to go back. Maybe when my son wakes up, I'll go back and check it out. But it's good to know as we finish the season that this is not necessarily something that people just who have seen the BBC version are realizing, but now you can find it in the books themselves. And whether or not it stems from Barbara Kellerman still remains to be seen, but it's definitely now in books that people are picking off of a Barnes & Noble shelf or a library shelf, which is really interesting here. I'm so happy that Laura pointed this out. And it makes me we talk about this all the time. I sound like a broken record, but I love our listeners who just really make this show 10 times better than you and I ever could.
Oh yeah, we're much stronger with people writing in and communicating stuff like this. Yeah. This is great.
So thank you so much, Laura, for pointing this out and giving us this information.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Phil, we got one final email here from Bella. You want to read this one?
I do. Bella says, "Hi, Phil and Daniel. Thank you so much for your podcast. I started listening to it beginning with your analysis of The Silver Chair. When I read the Narnia series, The Silver Chair happened to be my least favorite. I didn't like it because it was so different from the first 3 books. However, it was and still is the book I relate to the most. I no longer dislike this book, so thank you for changing my mind. My top 3 favorite books would have to be The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Horse and His Boy, and The Last Battle. I'm so excited for y'all to dive into the last 2. So, on to what I wanted to point out. In episode 2 of season 1, Daniel talked about Mr. Tumnus's telling Lucy about the dryads and nymphs when they would dance with the fauns before the 100-year winter. Mr. Tumnus also talked about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarves in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor. Could the red dwarves be another term for the earthmen found in the Underlands? My theory is that before the White Witch, the earthmen, called red dwarves by fellow Narnians, would frequent the surface only for social events, and lived and coincided with fellow Narnians, only that they lived under the surface. During the 100-year winter, they either served the White Witch or stayed hidden underground, where they forgot about Narnia and the surface world over the course of several generations. Then they found themselves under the rule of another witch, who is very mysterious, I might add. It is possible that the red dwarves and earthmen are 2 separate species, but I don't believe that. Another possibility is that some earthmen left to serve the White Witch, and the others stayed behind in the Underlands, where they sealed themselves off from the rest of society. What do you think? I thought that it was really cool to notice that, and it may be possible that Lewis used that line for inspiration. Thank you for all you do, Bella."
All right. Thank you, Bella, for this email and a great theory. And we've talked about this many times, but I never get tired of saying this. One of the great things about Lewis's world building, which I don't think he gets enough credit for, is that because he plays so fast and loose with so much of his mythology, we are able to have great theories like this from Bella. We could never do this in Middle-earth. Like, we could be like, I wonder where these guys came from. Like, well, actually, go to the appendices or go to the Silmarillion, and boom, there you go.
Section 3, it clearly states here that, yeah.
I have in front of me the closest thing we have to that, which is not written by Lewis. This is written by Paul F. Ford. I've got the the companion to Narnia, in front of me. And I looked up the entry on red dwarves, or dwarfs, if we want to do it the way that Lewis wrote it. And all that is written here is that in peace, red dwarves are treasure seekers and love wild dances and rich feasts and brightly colored clothes. Really just kind of pointing us back to actually what we learned from Tumnus, which Bella pointed out in her email.
It really sounds plausible. And when you keep in mind the timeline, I think it makes a lot of sense. What's hard about this is I don't know if we'll ever really know. And we don't know, did Lewis have this decided and he just chose not to show it? Or was this it just happens to make sense? Or it's hard to know. And I kind of like that. I like that there's some mystery to it.
Yeah, I don't think they could be exactly the same. You know, when we first learn about these gnomes, remember they come in all different shapes and sizes. I think there's ones that are even like 7 feet tall, right? So they're not like the red dwarfs would be traditionally about like 3 or 4. I think like 4 feet tall about. So there's a lot more diversity in size in the Earthmen, which we do not see in dwarfs. But let's think about this even outside the 100-year winter. We don't know a ton about the Earthmen or how long they've been there. Could there have been some kind of division that took place during the 1,000 years between Wardrobe and Caspian? That to me might be something that might make a little bit more sense. 100 years isn't necessarily enough time for a significant change if we're talking even about like their biology or something. But again, we're also working with magic here, right? I even think, we talked a lot about Tolkien in these emails, but I think about how you see this kind of separation of elves that aren't, when you think about the sundering of the elves that you see in the Silmarillion, the elves are all still elves, right? But there's different kind of groups of elves at the very beginning of time. And so I wonder if we're looking at something more like that. It's unclear, but again, this is a great way to think about. It's just great that Lewis gives us so much to play with. We're just kind of all playing in his sandbox, right? We got our toys and we can make them do kind of whatever we want in some ways. We have to keep it within Lewis's world, which is why my biggest issue with this is kind of figuring out how to reconcile these different sizes that we see of the Earthmen. So I'd love to even know Bella's thoughts on that, because maybe I'm overthinking something. I'm not 100% sure.
It also could be a vitamin D deficiency if you don't have enough sunlight coming in.
Okay, that could be it too. One thing I did want to point out here is that Paul Fort, and again, this is not necessarily canonical because it's not written by Lewis, but he does follow closely to what we see in the Chronicles. He puts it there's 3 types of dwarves in Narnia. There are the red dwarves, the black dwarves, and then the duffers he considers dwarves, which I don't know that I would have considered them to be dwarves, but I'll trust Ford on this. He knows more than we do. But he does not include the Earthmen in that. Again, just as he includes them under the entry, their own entry kind of with gnomes. I think it's under Earthmen here. And again, he doesn't make any relationship between dwarfs. But I think, I'm kind of talking in circles now because I love this. I love the fact that we're kind of letting our imaginations run wild here.
To me, it's so interesting. We've been talking a lot about Tolkien and Lewis, and there are 2 different approaches. One is to construct this massive world over the course of a decade plus, and then write some stories in it. And I feel like Lewis is just pulling from more stuff and writing more stories toward the beginning. I love how both of them are activating our imaginations. And we were just talking before we started recording about how you read the appendices of The Lord of the Rings before you read the books.
Correct,
and
yeah,
which is so funny to me when you were in 5th grade, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
And says a lot about you. But I also love how we just thought about this for a long time in preparation to respond to this email. And it's funny how, because he left it to the imagination, now we're thinking about it much more. But there's a balance there, right? You can't just describe something and never go into detail. He gave us enough that it makes it interesting. There are at least 2 different versions, and they're 1,000 years apart. That works really well. Yeah,
and the more I'm thinking about this, I'm wondering, even outside of this connection between the red dwarfs and the Earthmen, although we have not decided on this podcast if we're going by dwarves or dwarfs, so I just keep going back and forth. I hope that's okay for everybody. I wonder if the Earthmen, did they originally come from Bism? Like, we don't really know what happens before Golg, right? We don't have a ton of background at this point. Is Bism where they're originally from, when at the creation of Narnia? Or is it something that they went down into? We know, obviously, they're returning in the Silver Chair, then they were brought up. But the question is that where they originate from? Or, like Bella's saying, were they potentially surface dwellers originally and over thousands of years made their way below ground more permanently? I don't know. That's another interesting question for me is, were they there from the creation of Narnia? That's just something else that's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Well, Bella, that was really fun. I love being able to talk about these things, getting our minds just imagining things. It's so beautiful about Narnia. It's why these are such great books, not just for children, but for adults. But in particular, I love how this kind of thing, I see this with my students. I I see this with kids all the time, just the way that these books really just let your imagination run wild. And many of us as people who fell in love with these books as children can relate to that. So Bella, thank you so much for bringing that to the show. It's a great email.
Definitely. We really appreciate it.
All right, Phil. Well, that brings us to the end of season 4. That brings us to the end of our coverage of the Silver Chair. But before we go, we should at least give an idea of what listeners can expect over the next couple of months and into the start of the 5th book, The Horse and His Boy.
Right. Well, we're going to have a hiatus, but we will be offering some hiatus episodes to keep everyone entertained while they wait for the next chapters to come out.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, we're going to be releasing The Horse and His Boy sometime probably in the early summer is when we'll be back with that book. But don't worry, we have multiple episodes planned between now and then. The release might be, it won't be every 2 weeks necessarily, but again, always look for the show on Wednesdays. But for The Horse and His Boy, I'm really excited the reason we have a little bit longer of a hiatus again is because we need a little bit of extra time to prepare because we are approaching this book differently than all the other books that we have covered. So Phil, tell us a little bit more about that. I know we've already mentioned it a couple of times.
We're going to rotate the book 180 degrees.
We're going to start with the
upside down.
Yeah, and start with the last chapter, and then we're going to Benjamin Button this thing, and then the last episode will be the first chapter.
That's right. And
so
we're going to release the episodes that same way. No, not really. What we're going to do is this time I'm going to have read the entire book, and I am going to giggle with Is it mirth? I'm going to giggle while Daniel struggles to guess what is going to happen in each next chapter.
That is correct. You will be our guide through The Horse and His Boy, and I will be the companion. So I'm excited. I actually read the first chapter of The Horse and His Boy. As soon as we finished this chapter of The Silver Chair, I was like, all right, I can read the first chapter of Horse and His Boy now.
But then you had to stop. How did that feel?
Frustrating. It felt very frustrating to not be able to go on. I'm already starting to try to come up with my predictions for what will happen in chapter 2 because I don't want to seem foolish as I come on here and completely guess wrong. So I guess I have an idea of what you feel like now.
Yeah. It's good empathy training for Daniel.
But yeah, it's going to be really fun. We've got, like I said, so we've got that planned out, and then we do have some hiatus episodes planned between now and the start of that. So we won't leave our listeners hanging for a couple of months. We'll make sure that there's content being produced and released for listeners to enjoy.
That's right.
Now, one final thing I'll say before we go is we did this last year. We are over on Twitter going to be doing kind of a March Madness bracket starting on March 1st. Last year we did the characters from Narnia from the first 3 books, and then we had a fun one kind of in August again with Lord of the Rings and Narnia, and we talked about that on the Dancing Lawn. We're going to do that again this March, but we're not doing Narnia characters. We're doing some Narnia characters. We're actually doing characters from multiple different fantasy series. So we're going to be pulling characters from Narnia, Lord of the Rings. We've got stuff from the Stormlight Archives, The Wheel of Time, Harry Potter. We've got a couple. I think I'm even going to do Artemis Fowl. I know you're a fan of Artemis Fowl, Phil.
Yes.
So I figured you could help us with that.
Heck yes.
And we're looking for maybe one more fantasy series. So I think we're going to put a poll out maybe a week before March begins to ask listeners, hey, give us one more fantasy. Probably the Kingkiller Chronicles as well too. So we're going to do a poll every single day in the month of March between these 2 fantasy characters. That'll be over on Twitter. I think we've already mentioned that we're really not, I don't have Facebook and you don't really get on Facebook. So, that we do have a page there, but we kind of stopped using it. So we should just let people know that if you send us messages there, I can't see them and Phil won't check it. So,
but we are available via email. We love voicemails.
Oh, always. Yeah.
And, Daniel's pretty active on our Twitter page.
Yeah, and again, I always say, I'm pretty active on the Twitter page. Everything that is tweeted that you like was by me, and Phil does get in every once in a while, and if so there's a tweet that you, for some reason, don't like or don't think is funny, that was when Phil logged in.
Mm-hmm.
So
never happened.
Have you ever tweeted anything on the page?
No.
Okay, so now that kind of throws me under the bus for all of it. So,
Right.
But yeah, so that'll be over in March. Phil and I will be working together on that, and that'll be a fun thing. So just, hey, if you want some other fun fantasy stuff to talk about, come on over to Twitter, follow along with us there. Maybe we'll talk about some of that in one of our dancing lawns to talk through some of the results of that. But just wanted to point that out as just another fun thing we'll be doing between these two books. So now finally, it is time to wrap up this episode. And so as always, we want to remind our listeners that this episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. And I'll also remind listeners who maybe aren't patrons but are considering it that now we have almost a year and a half, I guess, worth of Dancing Lawn episodes. So if you're looking for something else, you're missing us over the hiatus, you can definitely check out some the Dancing Lawn over there. $2 a month. It's just $2 a month to support us at the Dancing Lawn level to get that podcast. But there are other tiers as well, and so special thanks goes out to Elias Dean, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, Emily Margaret, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our top tiers. You can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter account, and if you have any feedback, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. As always, we appreciate reviews over on Apple Podcasts because this helps other listeners find the show and join together through our read-through. Finally, a thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for the Silver Chair this season. We will see you next time with The Horse and His Boy.
See you then.